God has instilled various callings within our hearts. He calls us to life, faith, and Himself, as well as to love and to love our neighbors. He sent His only Son, Jesus, to serve as a true example of how to live our lives from a place of love. Additionally, God calls us to different states of life where we can best serve Him using the unique gifts and talents that He has blessed us with. He has a plan and a purpose for our lives and desires to work with us in partnership. Some individuals recognize the purpose of their lives, which God has called them to. However, at times, it may not be immediately evident, and certain experiences must be undergone before we're ready to receive, hear, and accept God's calling for us. Nevertheless, our callings persist within us. Although we may attempt to disregard, or exchange them, when God has implanted a calling in our hearts, it's ours for eternity. On this episode of Relentless Hope, Pastor Christian Aranza delves into honoring the gift of God's calling and the obstacles that may accompany it. He shares how, as a young boy, he recognized that he was destined to be a man of God who would preach the gospel and change the world, but he was not prepared to embrace this calling immediately. We learn about Pastor Christian's battle to surrender and eventually embrace his calling, as well as his moments of doubt. We also learn about how, after Pastor Christian had an affair, he believed he had lost his calling, but God had other intentions. We learn that to be a great leader, we must first comprehend where and what God has called us to lead. As Pastor Christian explains, knowing this creates a passion within us, enabling us to become relentless and resilient in the face of challenges and immense stress. We also learn about how Pastor Christian desires to leave behind several legacies. One of them is his dedication to building relationships and never giving up on people. He hopes that his children will remember him as their best friend, always present for them and serving as their greatest coach and encourager. He was a fantastic husband who adored his wife and demonstrated his love for her every day. And lastly, that he was crazy about his kids because he believes that is God's heart, that God is madly in love with all of us, his children. Pastor Christian reminds us that God calls us to serve in various ways and in different areas, including our families, our churches, our businesses, and everything in between. Every interaction we have with others provides an opportunity for us to honor the gift of God's calling. As Christian Aranza went into the Air Force, he found himself making a deal with God.
But he looked at me and he said, "Just tell me, son, as long as you haven't been unfaithful to Alex, we can fix this." And in that moment, it was like the enemy just spoke to me and said, "You see, the one thing that you can't fix, you did. The one thing that will ruin you is what you did. And you still can't tell anybody." I had no one. As the pastor's son, who was I going to go to and go, "Hey, I had a conversation I shouldn't have had." I just knew as soon as I did that, the gig was up. And the relationship ended up coming out. Either that night or the next day it came out. And all I know is we got in a fight. When it came out, I left. And when I came back, everything in the house was gone. There was a mattress there. And there was her wedding ring there. And that was it. And I sat on the bed. And I had one of my guns that was with me. And I sat on the bed thinking, this is over. You've ruined your life. You've ruined your calling. You've thrown away your anointing. The thing that people told you were going to do your whole life, the thing you were made for, you've messed that up even.
On part 1 of this 3-part series, we'll hear from Christian Aranza, head pastor at Valley Rise Church in Houston, Texas, as he tells us about his early life journey. Starting as a young boy, getting into trouble, and growing into a young man joining the military, he shares with us all the trials that came along his journey to become the pastor of his own church.
My name is Christian Aranza, and I am from Lafayette, Louisiana, home of the Raging Cajuns. Lived there the majority of my life growing up. And my family, great family background. My father was a pastor. He actually was a pastor, I guess, when I turned 14. Before that, he was an evangelist, and he traveled about 265 days out of the year, almost every year. Was gone a lot. I have 4 brothers and a sister that we adopted when I was a little older, but 4 brothers that I grew up with the majority of my life. And very close. You know, when your dad's gone all the time and your mom's bearing the weight of the majority of the household, we were all very close. And I'm the second oldest in that bunch. 5 boys, wild. You know, a house of boys is always crazy. And so you got to fight for everything you have, and you got to eat the food when you can. And it was always a madhouse. But I was raised loving God. We went to church. I don't think I ever woke up on a morning when my dad was home that I didn't see my dad walking around the living room praying, or on his face praying. And I have vivid memories until I was too big for him to carry me, where I'd come in the mornings and he'd carry me and walk around with me, man, for probably an hour, just praying over me and praying over me. I was born in Lindell, Texas, I guess technically. Lived in between Leonard Ravenhill and Keith Green. Leonard Ravenhill, one of the great revivalists in American Christianity, was one of my dad's mentors and pastors. When I was born, he dedicated me to the Lord, gave me the Bible. He preached out of for 20 years, and told my dad, I know you think it'll be Jacob Jr., who's my dad's namesake, that will carry the mantle, but it's not. It's going to be Christian. I knew that from the time I was young, and that wasn't ever something they hid from me. If anything, it was something I fought, I think. They made it very clear that I was made to preach the gospel. I was going to change the world. I don't remember a day going by where my dad didn't look at me and say, you're going to change the world. You're going to change the world. God made you for a purpose. You're going to preach the gospel. You're going to be a man of God. And as awesome as that is, I think it put a weight on me from a young age that I didn't know what to do with. I wanted to be normal, but I went to school every day with this weight of everyone else's salvation on me, I guess, almost. Played sports my whole life growing up, and really tried to do whatever I could to take away from the self-imposed pressure, probably. I don't think my parents ever meant to put that pressure on me. Maybe the self-imposed pressure of, you're going to be a preacher. You're going to be a preacher. You're going to change the world. You're going to reach people. And I just wanted to be like everybody else. I just wanted to be a kid. And so played sports, was really good at hockey, and ended up traveling around the world and playing hockey. But I never could get away from the upbringing, I guess, that I had. My parents were always, my dad, when I was 14, started a church, great church, still there to this day, 4 campuses, 9,000 people, awesome church in South Louisiana. And so once the church started to grow, people I became the heir apparent. Christian's going to take over. Christian's going to take over. Christian's going to take over. And I started to kind of resent that. Started at a young age, 16, 17, resenting that idea, and really embracing the pastor's kid. Pastor's kids are bad. Pastor's kids are wild. Pastor kids are. And so started using drugs and partying probably my junior year of high school. My junior year of high school, I sat down with my dad. I'd gotten kicked off the basketball team for my grades failing, and really had kind of just given up on school. My friendships were suffering. Had walked away from hockey, and sat down with my dad and just said, listen, I'm miserable. I've been partying and using drugs, and I just am miserable. I need to go someplace I could start over, where I'm not Jacob Aranza's son, where I'm not the son of the preacher in the town that has this big church, and I just want to be me. And so went to live in Detroit, Michigan with the person that I call my uncle, who has a church up there, and moved into what at that point was the worst ghetto in America. It had the highest crime rate in America. I moved there in February. There was already 76 murders in mid-February. It was a XXX theater. They had turned into a church. Across the street was the Worldwide Peep Show. To the left was Larry Flint's Deja Vu Strip Club. To the right was the Crown Transvestite Prostitute Hotel. And when I moved there, they told me, if you buy drugs here, they will kill you. And I believed them. I was one of the only, I'm Hispanic, but I was one of the only non-African-American people in the city. The city was bankrupt. The schools had no windows because of the drive-by shootings that would happen there. And so it was a concrete building. I didn't even go to school there, but I would go to school sometimes with my friends just to see them. And it was, I remember coming home and going, there were two, they weren't even white, I guess. They were non-African-American, or they were mixed students in the entire school of about maybe 1,000 plus students, 2,000 students. And so I began to learn a lot about life there. I moved back down to the South after my junior year and finished high school. Going into, I guess, what would have been my freshman year of college, I began to really fight the call that God had on me. I'd gone to a couple of months of a little master's commission and kind of, okay, maybe I'll jump in. But every time I get close to jumping into what my call was, I was scared to death. And so I'd pull back. I wasn't ready. I knew that when I jumped in, it was going to be a big deal, and I wasn't ready for that. So spent another 2 years really of my life just partying and going crazy and indulging in anything I could, and was sitting in a Transformers movie, and there was a man wearing an Air Force uniform and doing a job that I thought looked cool. And looked over at my friend and said, when we leave here, I'm signing up for the military. And he said, nah, you're crazy. And I said, I'm going to do it. And really what I thought I was doing was getting away from my calling. I thought I'll do something so crazy that I won't have to be a preacher. And so left the movie theater and went to the recruiter's office and walked in and said, I want to sign up. And he said, what do you want to do? I said, whatever will get me a uniform. I want to sign up. I ended up as a medic, did 4 years as a medic in the Air Force and loved it. Great experience, awesome. And I had to deal with God. When I went in, I had just started dating my now wife and heard all these horror stories. You're going to go off to war. She's going to find someone else. And was laying in basic training. It was at the height of the war, Iraq, Afghanistan, 2007. And was laying there, and I asked our drill instructor that day, does everyone deploy? Are you sure we're going to deploy? And he said, everyone will deploy. Every single person will deploy that comes into the military in this time. And so laid in bed, put my head under my pillow, and I said, God, if you let me not deploy, I'll be a preacher. Not because I was scared. I just didn't want to lose the person that I knew I was going to spend my life with. And said, God, if you let me not deploy, I'll be a preacher when I get out of here. And so finished my training up, and first round of deployments came up and I didn't get picked. And second round of deployments came up the next year. I didn't get picked. And now I'm in my fourth year. I'm now married to my then girlfriend, and we're living up there. And now I want to deploy because I realize, man, you get to make money and all my friends are going, and I want to have this experience. I've trained now 3 years to do a job. I want to go over there and do it. I want to support the guys that I love. And had a last opportunity where I thought I would deploy, and I got passed over on. I have no clue. I had buddies deployed 2 and 3 times. It just my number never got picked. So when I finished, I remember vividly my last month in having a conversation with God. And at this point, I wasn't really sold out yet, even on the concept of being a Christian. I loved Jesus, but that was about all that I knew. And I didn't think I was going to be a preacher. I just started serving at a church and kind of attending a church in Florida where I was stationed, and had a talk with Jesus where I said, God, you held up your end of the deal. I'm going to hold up my end of the deal. I'll be a preacher, and I'll go back to my home church, Dad's church. I'll go to college, and I'll just serve. I'll work my way in. And obviously, God's plans are always different than our plans. Right about probably the next day, I got a call from a man who was like a spiritual father to me, and he said, "Hey, I'm going to teach as an adjunct professor at Oral Roberts University in Tulsa, Oklahoma, and they do these scholarship competitions. I think you need to come up. If you're interested in going to ministry, you need to come up and go through the scholarship competition. Just see what you get. Well, the military was going to pay for my college anyways, so as a favor to him, and because I trust him, I said, okay, I'll go over there and see. And so we went through the whole day of scholarship competitions, and I'll tell you, coming off of a military installation and walking onto the campus of Oral Roberts University was a major culture shock. And finished the day, and we were walking off of there. I'll never forget walking down from the back side of the campus, and me and my wife were walking, and she looks at me and she says, well, what do you think? Is this where we're supposed to be? Is this where God has us? And I looked at her and I said, they're going to have to pay me to come to school here. This place is weird. And went back to my life, was finishing my last month of out processing out of the military, and bowling with some friends one night, get a call as I'm at a store down the road picking up socks to go bowling. And the lady says, hey, this is so-and-so from Oral Roberts University. And hey, great, thanks. She goes, well, I'm calling to let you know that out of the 3,200 people, we picked, I think it was three full scholarship recipients. And you're one of the whole person scholarship recipients. And I said, what do you mean? She said, well, we're going to pay for all of your school. We're giving you an $80,000 scholarship. All of your school will be taken care of. And I literally said, you're telling me y'all are going to pay me to go to school? And she said, yep. And I got off the phone and just laughed. And I thought, people say you can't make deals with God. That's just kind of how it's worked for me always. And so went to Oral Roberts University, loved it. I think it's one of the greatest colleges in America. Had a blast there. Was on campus for about a year and a half. Me and my wife got pregnant at that time. My pop said, why don't you come back and help us do a college ministry? We need someone to take over the college ministry. You can come in and do that, be here, have your child here. And we were ready to be home. And so we moved back to Lafayette, Louisiana, and I became a college pastor and continued school online, but really threw my heart into being a college pastor. I was not your typical college pastor. Probably was not your typical, I probably to this day am still not your typical pastor. I fought tooth and nail to be me. I grew up around a lot of pastors that seemed not really genuine to me, or even if they were genuine, they just came off as fake or too good, or man, people can't be like that. And I remember telling my wife, I want people to see me and go, if he can do it, I can do it. And so started doing ministry, and like all young preachers and ministers, and if you have God gave me a gift to preach, and start preaching and being able to travel some, and got really hooked on, I got to build this ministry to show that I'm not just here because of my dad. That's what I got all the time, oh, you're just going to take over your dad's church, or people would look at me and it was kind of like this, you're here just because of your dad, you don't really have the qualifications, you're not really the right guy, but you're here because of your dad. And I was dead set on proving that wrong. I would work endlessly. I would spend time endlessly. I would do whatever I had to do to show that I was there because I was qualified, because I was good enough, and because I was called. And I realized that, looking back now, I started working my way up into kind of a burnout, and just getting into a frenzy. And my wife would go, who are you trying to prove wrong? And I would just say, everyone. I got to prove everyone wrong. I got to show them I deserve to be here. And that worked really good for about a year and a half, until one day I realized that I was way off track. I woke up one morning and found myself in a position where I was a month and a half into a relationship with a woman that was not my wife. I didn't know how I got there. I didn't know how to get out of there. I remember probably meeting with a few people in the month leading up to when the affair started, and saying, I feel like I'm about to throw it all away. I feel like, what do you do when you feel like you're about to throw it all away? And people just saying, hey, just press into Jesus and love him, and, you got this. But I had no one I could open up to. I had no one I could sit across the table from and say, I am having conversations with a woman that's not my wife that I should not be having. I'm traveling with a person that's not my wife that I should not be traveling with. And before I knew it, it was too late. I'd gotten sucked in. And, I think The enemy is very tricky, and he's great at getting us places that before we know it, you blink and you go, how in the world did I get here? And it's how it felt that I opened my eyes and I just thought, how did I get here? There was no off ramp. Once I stepped on, it was like warp speed to where I am now. And I started to get distant and started to question my calling, and all of this while I'm preaching and while I'm maintaining what God's doing and while I'm speaking, talking to people and counseling people. And on the inside, I was just falling apart. And my wife knew it. She knew I was empty on the inside. And I remember her calling my dad over one day and just going like, you got to come talk to Christian. You got to talk to Christian. I don't know what's wrong. Something's wrong, but I don't know what it is. And sitting down across from my dad on the couch and him saying, son, just tell me, please tell me, getting on his knees, please tell me what's going on. Please tell me what's wrong. And knowing that if I said what was really going on, I was throwing away everything. I was throwing away my calling. I was throwing away the anointing. I was throwing away this position that I'd worked so hard to show people I was worth having. And I remember him, and I love my dad to death. He's the greatest man on the face of this earth. He did the best that he could in every situation. I never doubt that for a second. But he looked at me and he said, just tell me, son, as long as you haven't been unfaithful to Alex, we can fix this. And in that moment, it was like the enemy just spoke to me and said, you see, the one thing that you can't fix, you did. The one thing that will ruin you is what you did. And you still can't tell anybody. I had no one. As the pastor's son, who was I going to go to and go, hey, I had a conversation I shouldn't have had. I just knew as soon as I did that, the gig was up. And the relationship ended up coming out. Either that night or the next day it came out. And all I know is we got in a fight. When it came out, I left. And when I came back, everything in the house was gone. There was a mattress there. And there was her wedding ring there. And that was it. And I sat on the bed, and I had one of my guns that was with me. And I sat on the bed thinking, this is over. You've ruined your life. You've ruined your calling. You've thrown away your anointing. The thing that people told you were going to do your whole life, the thing you were made for, you've messed that up even. And there's no way that you can come back from this. And when people say I've never contemplated taking my life, I can't say that that's not true. In that moment, I contemplated what that would be like. Thank God for my son, who at that point was 1, and just maybe he was 1. I don't even know if he was 1 yet, and just knew that I couldn't do that. I had to fix this thing. I began a 6-month process of trying to win my wife back. She didn't talk to me for 3 months. I went to a whole health retreat place to help me figure out. I think the most frustrating part for me was I didn't know how I had gotten there. I knew what had happened and I knew the decisions I made for it to happen, but I couldn't understand how I got there, how I let myself get to that place. And so I went and sat down with some amazing people who helped me see how I got to that place and helped me see the gaps that maybe I had missed from childhood on, and why I had this need that I fulfilled in a wrong way. I think it's important to know that in that process, God was never, people ask me, do you feel convicted? I didn't ever feel like God was mad at me. I didn't ever feel God was angry with me or frustrated with me or put out with me. It's probably the closest I've ever felt to the love of God in my entire life, is after everything hit the fan. And I started to work a normal job. I honestly thought ministry was over for me. I knew that that was my shot and I'd blown it. And so I started working a normal job and sold cars at a guy's car dealership for a couple months, and then got a job doing selling janitorial supplies for a company. And I was miserable. On the inside, I knew God had given me this gift and this calling. And while I tried to let go of this calling, the calling would not let go of me. And I'd lay in bed at night and weep and weep and weep because I just wanted the calling to let go of me. And it wouldn't. And Me and my wife, we're now back together. We're 6 months into this process. We're back together. Things are going good. I'm working through the process of restoring the heart of this woman that I love deeply, and having conversations and seeing her broken, and then this process of God, man, and going to a job that I hate during the day, going to a job just trying to shake the memories of what I had lost, and how badly I'd let my dad down and felt like I let the church down. And I'll never forget, I was in the parking lot of my grandmother's furniture store in Lafayette, Louisiana, and I got a call. I was sitting in a PT Cruiser that was the company car that I worked for. I mean, I remember like it was yesterday, and I get a call, and I answer the phone, and it's Pastor Dino Rizzo, who's like an uncle to me, and now a pastor to me, and said, how you doing? And I just looked around and just thought, really, if he really knew how I was doing, he probably wouldn't even be calling me. If he really knew I was selling janitorial supplies, he probably wouldn't want anything to do with me. And I said, what we all say, oh, you're doing good, man, just working and loving my wife, thankful my wife is with me. And I was at that point. I could have never been in ministry again. I was grateful I had my wife, my child. And he said, well, I just got off the phone with Pastor Chris Hodges. He wants to know if you want to come up and come on the team at Highlands. And I will never be able to duplicate the feelings of that moment. I will be loyal to Church of the Highlands, Pastor Dino and Pastor Chris, till the day that I die. And I would give my heart and soul for them because they saved me. They saved my life. They saved my calling. They saved my marriage. And the next couple months, we moved up to Church of the Highlands and came on the team. And no one that I thought I was going to go there, and everyone was going to know, and no one knew, and no one brought it up, and people saw me differently. And I began to walk in this process of restoration and was on staff at Church of the Highlands for 3 years. It's the greatest church in America. I will be way over my head if I can build a church like Church of the Highlands. Pastor Chris is the greatest pastor in America. Pastor Dino, those guys, I owe my life to them. My children owe their lives to them. My wife owes our marriage to them. And begin this process of learning what it looked like to do healthy life and healthy marriage and not have the weight of being the pastor's son and just being there, being me. And they embraced me with such open arms, and I learned how to do life differently. I learned how to overcome something that I never thought I could overcome. And the crazy thing about it is that my whole life I thought I was going to work hard enough to work my way up the ranks, that maybe a church like that would one day call me and go, you're so good that we've got to have you. And it's such the grace of God, because what happened was it was the exact opposite. I was so bad that God said, now I'm going to put you in a place that had nothing to do with what you were able to do. Now you'll experience what the grace of God really is, because you'll know that it has nothing to do with you. It's all about me. And I begin the greatest journey ever. That journey is continuing now, and is still blows my mind that I am on this journey, and that my family's with me, and that I'm just blown away that God lets me do what I get to do. We were there 3 years and then just planted a church almost a year ago. I could talk for 25 minutes about what Highlands means to me, and they were with me through the craziest times of my life, the craziest times of my marriage. Little did I know, going up there a year after I was going to be there, my brother would pass away in a motorcycle accident, and for them to walk through that with me, love me, and I get up to speak at the funeral in Louisiana and look out there, and my best friends in the world from Highlands are sitting out there. They've driven all night to be there. And I just broke on them, and I'm weeping, and they just looked at me and they said, we're doing life together. We're not letting you do this alone. We're not letting you. And when I look at people that inspire me and things that inspire me, it's just people that just go, hey, we're big enough to be small. We're big enough to be here for you. We're big enough to be a part of every story. We're not scared of your dirt. We're not scared of your sin. We're not scared of your stain. We're not scared of your reputation. Let's do life together. And I think that's what we've tried to build our church on, is let's just do life with people. Let's not worry about their story, what it looks like, how bad it is. let's just do life with people. And that journey led us into planting Valley Rise Church in January 28th of 2017. I started to realize that it's kind of like being in the weight room. There's this thing with leadership where it's really heavy, and about 2 months in, I looked at my wife and I said, you know what? I feel like I got this. Like, I feel like I was in the weight room and they put a lot of weight on the bar and it fell on my chest. But after lifting it for a little bit, now it's comfortable and now I can hold it up, and it's still there, but it's not crushing me. And 2 weeks later, it's like God said, okay, good, then you're ready for me to put another plate on the bar. And it got heavier. And then there was this month, 2-month period of adjusting. And then I thought, okay, I've got this. And now it's in this ebb and flow where you go, okay, God, when I can handle the weight, and when I'm ready to handle more weight. And I think all of us as leaders have different characteristics. I think my characteristic, and it comes out a lot in carrying this weight, is I'm just very resilient. I'm incredibly resilient. I could have the worst day. Everyone could leave me today. I'm going to wake up in the morning and go, okay, we're going to figure this out. I don't know how, but we're going to figure it out.
On part 2 of this 3-part series, we'll hear from Pastor Christian Aranza as he discusses navigating relationships, being a leader through vulnerability, and dealing with the unique weight that comes from being a leader.
Life happens fast, and it's like you blink and all of a sudden people are calling you a leader, but you really don't feel like a leader. You still feel like you, I think. And so anyone out there who maybe feels like you don't feel like a leader, it's okay. None of us do. I feel like me, and people just follow me. But before I became a leader, I think it was like I'd look at these leaders and go, God, if I could be as authoritative as them, if I could be as perfect as them. My dad had such a horrible childhood. He grew up in the inner city of Houston, and multiple divorces and abuses, and his childhood was so bad, he never wanted us to see any of that. So he protected us from any of his deficiencies or we didn't see a lot of how hard life was. Dad was just always like the perfect man of God. And so growing up, I think I looked at that and thought, God, if I could be perfect, if I could just never get mad and never sin. And when I am tempted to get mad, be patient and go pray. And I mean, just all of the things that I saw my father do, who's an amazing leader, an amazing dad, an amazing father. I just wanted to be like that. And then I'd see people who were anointed and go, God, if I had that anointing, if I could just walk into a room and the presence of God come with me like that. If I could just speak and people listened because of who I was, if they saw this leadership thing that was on me, like I see it on this person or on that person. And I went to a Christian school when I was a kid, and so I always kind of have this funny memory definition of what a leader is. When I was a kid, my principal would tell me, all a leader is someone who can see further down the road than others. And the longer I live and the older I get, I feel like it's very true that oftentimes a leader is just someone who can see a little further down the road. When I look at people who taught me how to lead early years, it was my dad. It was my uncle, Tim Delina, who was the executive pastor of Brooklyn Tabernacle for a long time, and then is now down in Louisiana on staff with my father, and was a hero in the faith to me. And I looked at guys like Brother Ravenhill, Leonard Ravenhill, and his prayer life, and saw all these people that just had this amazing character. Brother Lynn was a prayer warrior. No one could pray like Brother Ravenhill. Pray for 6-7 hours. And my Uncle Tim was an amazing preacher. No one could study and preach like him. My dad was this amazing person, leader. People were just drawn to him. He could walk into a room and captivate people. He always knew what to say. He always had the right wisdom for people. And I just started to look at these things and go, God, if I could be like that, that's what I'd want to lead like. And then went up to Highlands and got around a whole different style of leadership, and was around Pastor Dino, who there is no more relational leader than Dino Rizzo. Dino Rizzo is the greatest gift to the body of Christ in the relational capacity that I know we'll ever see in my lifetime. And I'd wager to say ever, simply because of the social media and the connectivity that we have at this point in time. He is a Rolodex of relationships, and I try and model so much my relationships after what he does. He's just phenomenal. He's a wizard with people. And then I looked at Pastor Chris, and Pastor Chris is a very different leader. Chris Hodges is the most intentional leader I've ever been around. He's very disarming. There's nothing about Pastor Chris that when you're with him, do you feel like this weight heavy leader. He's not a authoritative leader. He's not a heavy-handed leader. He's very gentle. And, people that aren't around him at times will go, God, he seems like he's probably a control freak, or he's always got everything in order. And he probably does have everything in order in his mind. But I'll tell you, being on his team for 3 years, the things that stood out to me the most about him was when he would stand in front of us and weep. He would stand in front of us and just say, if the greatest thing I've ever done is assemble this team. I'm not as good as what we're doing. We serve a great God, and you are the best team in the world. If I didn't like you, if I didn't want to hang out with you every day, you wouldn't be on this team. And we had a very small staff of, for the second largest church in America, I think when I was there, we maybe had 300 people on staff. And you're talking 16, 17 campuses. So that was huge for us to be that small as a staff, but be running that big of a church. And so everybody knew everybody. And especially me and Pastor Chris, because we're both from Louisiana, and him and Dad are dear friends, and me and his sons are very close. And I've had an open door into a lot of those guys' lives that I think other people haven't had. And so being around him for 3 years, I was blown away, not by his intentionality, although he is, not by his brilliance, although he's brilliant. I was blown away by the humility with which he carried all of it. I was blown away that he could cry in front of us. I was blown away that he could stand up there and go, listen, if you have sin in your life, so do I. And I need people to help me with it. Okay? So we all don't feel like if you're struggling with something, you're the only person. I'm struggling with things. I loved that he would stand up and say, hey, I'm the pastor, but the only thing that means is that God called me to be a communicator and a leader, and this is the gifting that he gave me. I serve on the dream team just like everybody else. This is just the capacity he called me to serve in. And there was this humility that he would cloak everything he carried in that blew my mind. That I'd always, you think of a leader, and a leader is kind of captivating, and they're charismatic, and they're friendly, and they make the whole room laugh, and yet he did all those things by being very subtle and being very humble and being very disarming. And the only person I've ever met that was like that was Mark Rutland. And when I was at Oral Roberts, Dr. Rutland is the greatest teacher I've ever been around. And Dr. Rutland would walk around before chapel, and he'd talk to everyone like he knew you. If it was the first time you ever talked to him, or maybe the 100th time you talked to him, he acted like he knew you, like he was there hanging out with only you. And I think Pastor Chris has the unique ability to be able to do that as well. With people, especially on his team, to be able to come up and ask questions that are really good, and to know that he's caring about you and thinking about you, and if you need anything, he's there for you. I love, this is going to be surprising to people, but I love one of the things he would say, always say, Christian, never forget the little guy. And I think people look at me and would say, Christian's not the little guy. What is that? I don't think anyone would categorize me as the little guy. I came out of a great family, out of a great church with a great legacy and a great name, and I'm 6'4", I'm tall, I think I'm charismatic, and I don't think anyone would look at me and say he's the little man. But I felt like the little man for the majority of my life. I always felt like I was fighting for what God had actually given to me to do. I felt like I was battling every other leader, and I felt like I had to fight for what was mine. And I always felt like the little guy, no more time a bit greater than sitting in my car where I thought I'd thrown away my calling, and Pastor Chris called me. And so I love the concept of always remembering the little man, because I think inside of all of us, there's a little man. That even inside the greatest leaders, there's areas that we're insecure in and that we feel weak in. And Some people will tell you as a leader, don't let people see that. Let them see strength. Let them see that when it's hard, you trust God. And let them see, and I think they do need to know that you trust God and know that everything's going to be okay and know that you're not going to collapse for sure. But I think there's something beautiful about being able to be vulnerable in front of your congregation, about being able to be vulnerable in front of the people you're leading, being able to cry in front of them, being able to just go, hey, I can't do this without you guys. I wouldn't want to. You guys make this thing awesome. And so I think where I initially wanted to lead from my strengths and lead from how charismatic I was and lead from how great of a preacher I was and lead from the relationships that I had and lead from the wisdom that I had learned and lead from all of this plethora of things that I thought leadership was. Now, as I pastor this church, I've realized for me, God's called me, I think, oftentimes to lead in my weaknesses and to lead in my vulnerabilities. And to stand up in front of the church and go, hey, I can help you with your marriage because I've thrown my marriage away. And I know how to get it back. And I can walk through a death in the family with you because I've buried my 20-year-old brother. And I can walk through, I can walk through these issues with you because, man, I've messed up. I've not figured it out. I've gone astray and I've been lost. But I know that together with Jesus, we can figure it out. And I think that does a few things as a leader. I think it lets people see that anybody can be a leader. That leadership is nothing more than influence. And that when people see I don't have to be perfect to be a leader, I just have to have influence, then they're able to open up their heart and go, hey, then let me show you my scars. And if I can save you a scar or two, that makes me a leader. I don't have to be perfect to be a leader. I just have to be willing to share influence. I just have to be willing to give you my life. I just have to be willing to tell you what I did wrong. And I think it allows anyone to feel like they can lead. And I think that it cloaks that leadership in a humility that is attractive to people. That no one is looking at Christian Aranza going, well, he's got it all figured out. If anything, people are looking at me going, man, if God can use him, God can use anybody. And maybe I'm wrong, but I just like to position myself in that way because if God gets all the credit, then maybe he can use me more than what he would have been able to use me if I was getting any of the credit. I was raised to do this thing called church. This is all I've ever known. I was probably knowledge-based wise ready to run a church at 20. I don't know. I just knew so much and had been around it so long, been around all these great leaders for so long. This is what I was raised to do. I was a racehorse that was bred to run. And so now I have this chance to run and be a leader. And the funny thing they don't tell you about leadership is that until you're the leader, you don't feel the weight of leadership. And I can't speak for everyone. Maybe there's people out there that are youth pastors that feel that way. But as every senior pastor knows, and every senior pastor that listens to this will be nodding their head, there is a weight to this thing that no one warned me about. Jeremy Foster told me a week before we launched, 2 weeks before we launched, he said, Christian, the day you launch, you're going to go to sleep that night and there's going to be a weight on you that you can't explain. You can't share with anyone. No one will understand it but you and other people that are in this position. And it's going to rock you. And I thought, sure, okay, listen. Again, I was raised to do this. I was bred to do this. Maybe that's for normal leaders, I was in the military. I've dealt with stress, and these were all things that have been built into me. God made me to do this. And the day we launched that church, I went to sleep, and it felt like an elephant was sitting on my chest. It wasn't an emotional weight. It was a physical, tangible weight. I didn't know how to deal with it. All I can tell you is that it felt like maybe God just put this huge weight to push me to my face so that the only place I would be comfortable was on my face in front of him. I couldn't handle it. I would go to sleep every night thinking, I'm going to have a heart attack. I don't even know. It wasn't stress. It was this weight of leadership that I had never realized or understood. And all of a sudden, I felt really bad for making judgment calls on my leaders and maybe going, why didn't they do this? And why didn't they do that? And why didn't they do? But I had never carried that weight. And there's a big difference between making a decision when you're carefree and you don't have the weight and making a decision when you got 500 pounds on you. And you know, a step to the left could cause me to lose this weight, and a step to the right could cause me to lose this weight. And I got to walk carefully because this weight is heavy. I didn't know if I could handle it. I was blown away. The number one question I asked every single leader I talked to for the first 2 months of planning our church wasn't, hey, how do I grow my church? Hey, how do I do this? Hey, what do you guys do for communion or dream team or growth? It wasn't any of that. It was, how do you handle this weight? Where did this thing come from and how do I live with it? And I started to realize that it's kind of like being in the weight room. There's this thing with leadership where it's really heavy. And about 2 months in, I looked at my wife and I said, you know what? I feel like I got this. Like, I feel like I was in the weight room and they put a lot of weight on the bar and it fell on my chest. But after lifting it for a little bit, now it's comfortable and now I can hold it up and it's still there, but it's not crushing me. And 2 weeks later, it's like God said, okay, good. Then you're ready for me to put another plate on the bar. And it got heavier. And then there was this month, 2-month period of adjusting. And then I thought, okay, I've got this. And now it's in this ebb and flow where you go, okay, God, when I can handle the weight and when I'm ready to handle more weight. And I think all of us as leaders have different characteristics. I think my characteristic, and it comes out a lot in carrying this weight, is I'm just very resilient. I'm incredibly resilient. I could have the worst day. Everyone could leave me today. I'm going to wake up in the morning and go, okay, we're going to figure this out. I don't know how, but we're going to figure it out. A couple months into us starting the church, we had 4 of our key people, the people that I never thought were going to leave me, the people that were going to be with me forever that left me. And I remember my wife going, what are we going to do? And laying in bed, feeling the weight, seeing people leave me that I love, and going, you know what? We're going to wake up in the morning. We're going to trust God, and we're going to keep building. We're going to do what He's called us to do. I think, again, everyone's got different qualities. If someone was to say, hey, what do you think it takes to be a leader? I think inside of all of us, it's just a relentlessness that we won't quit. This resiliency, this relentlessness that listen, knock me down, kill me, crush me, leave me, abandon me, take all my money. I will not quit. And you look at David and you just go, God, if anyone wanted to quit, you don't think David ever wanted to quit? David had everyone wants to be David. No one wants to go through what David had to go through. I mean, God, this guy had a horrible life. And Moses, anyone that God used greatly just had this relentlessness. I'm just not going to quit. I love the story of David when he comes and they've killed all their families and taken everything, and the men wanted to kill him. And it says David encouraged himself in the Lord. And I think oftentimes as a leader, it's you and Jesus. And it's you going, you know what? I'm going to encourage myself in the Lord. And I don't care what happens. I'm not quitting. I'm not quitting. I am not quitting. Somebody needs me. Somebody needs me to do what God called me to do. I refuse to quit. If I quit, they're going to have to drag me out of here. I'm going to die before I quit. They're going to have to drag me out of here. Because I think there's a lot of great exit ramps in this thing called leadership. There's a lot of great opportunities as a leader to go, well, okay, I shouldn't be doing this, When we started a church, people thought, they're going to go back to his dad's church and take over. And when we decided to start a church and come do this, listen, you don't think I lay in bed at night? I'm 3.5 hours from my dad. You don't think I lay in bed at night sometimes going, well, you are an idiot. Why didn't you go take over your dad's church? They got 10,000 people, 4 or 5 campuses, money in the bank. What are you doing over here? And I don't know what to tell you, but when God calls you someplace, He calls you someplace. I love Houston. Like when I fell in love with my wife, I fell in love with Houston like that. And I think as a leader, when you fall in love with the calling that God has for you, when you fall in love with what He's anointed you to do, I don't care. I don't care if my wife would have left me for 5 years. That's who God called me to. I was going to wait. I was going to get her back. And I don't know what to tell you, but God called me to Houston. And I don't care what happens. I don't care if we got to meet in my house. I don't care if I am not leaving this city until God does what he told me he was going to do. And I think you got to have that resiliency. You got to have that strength of heart. You got to be able to get knocked down 1,000 times and still go, you know what? It doesn't matter. I'm going to do it. Even if it doesn't feel good, even if it doesn't feel like, I'm going to do it because it's what he put inside of me. You know, in where we live, the time period we live in, church planting has become very faddish, and everybody wants to plant a church. Everybody wants to do the next cool church, and there's all these cool names. And a lot of people are going, God, why isn't my church working? Or why isn't this happening? Or why isn't this happening? And I had a thought today, man, church planting is not a fad. It's a calling. It is a calling. And if you can't stand getting punched in the mouth repeatedly and still wake up and go, you know what? I still want to go out there and run this church. I can get tired in it, but I will never get tired of it. I'm going to go out there and I'm going to give 100% to this city every single day, no matter what happens. And I'm going to wake up the next morning and do it all over again. And I think if that's not in you, if you're not called and anointed to do that, you will be miserable. Church planting, it will be very, very hard for you, and leadership will be very, very hard for you. I think the greatest thing you can do as a leader is find out what God called you to lead, because once you know what he called you to lead, you're going to fall in love with it. You're going to be committed to it. And then if I can say for me personally what it is that drives me, I just refuse to quit. I'm not the smartest. I'm not the best. I'm not the brightest. I'm not the most intelligent, but I refuse to quit. I just am going to do what God called me to do. And I'm going to do it with a smile on my face. And there's going to be days I'm going to go to bed crying, and I'm going to wake up the next morning with a smile on my face. Listen, I think pastors, sometimes we can be some of the most depressed people in the world because this thing is so hard. And if you're not resilient, and if you don't wake up every day going, God, it's me and you, we're going to get this, we're going to figure it out, you're going to be miserable. And then as a leader, probably the next best thing I've ever done next to just being so headstrong not to quit is developing a great circle of friends. Relationships will save your life. If someone said, what's the number one thing I can do as a leader that's going to improve my longevity, that's going to grow me as a person, that's going to help whatever I'm leading, I would say get some good friends. I have a group of friends, man. I have some of the best friends in the world that aren't afraid to call me out, that I can sit down now and go, hey, I had a conversation I shouldn't have had, or I said something I shouldn't have said to my wife, or man, I want to go off and just lose my mind. Or I have people now that I can do that with, that can look at me and go, hey, listen, we're going to figure this out together. Hey, listen, I'm going to help you. I'm going to speak life into you when you want to quit. I'm going to speak hope into you when you want to give up. I'm going to tell you that you're never quitting because we're doing this together. And if you don't have those people, God, man, I can't imagine doing it alone. And there's people I call all the time, and there's people that call me all the time. I'm in multiple group texts with guys, and their whole job is just, let's make sure we finish strong. Because I don't care what anyone thinks about leaders. None of us do it alone. And if you do it alone, you don't finish strong. There's a reason that David had mighty men, that Jesus had disciples, that God sent Moses with Aaron, because this thing called leadership was not meant to be done alone. Leadership can be very lonely if you let it be. But I believe that God's heart is that we wouldn't lead lonely, that we would have relationships and we would have friendships and we would have people that can help us through all of because as a pastor, as a leader, I always tell our congregation, people think because I'm the pastor, I just don't deal with what they deal with. And the reality is I deal with it more, and then I deal with their problems. So I got to deal with my own issues. I'm only 31 years old. I got to deal with all of my stuff. God's still growing me, and I still have to learn, and God's still working on my heart in areas. And then I've got to help other people get there. And so it's no easier for us as leaders. I think God's just given us a unique ability to see a little further down the road. And, my heart as a leader is to lead humbly and just go, hey, I don't have it all figured out, but I do see where God wants to take us. And if I can get us all on the same page, and if I can rally the troops, and if I can share vision and encourage you and tell you I believe in you and you can do it and God made you for this, then we can all get there together and it'll be a great journey. I would be remiss to not mention a lot of guys who helped me as a leader, guys that loved me enough. The first person that ever showed any interest in me when I was running from God, when I was in the Air Force, was a man named Pastor Wayne. And Wayne Asperides, he was a pastor at a church in Florida that I went to, and running from God, running from the call, looked at me in his office and just said, God's got a call in your life. He said, if every one of us bleeds something, Christian, if they cut you open, you bleed relationships, and you can do this. He was the first person that ever brought me in to speak, and he would always encourage me and tell me, and so I think as leaders, some of the greatest things we can do is find those people and go, hey, you can do this. And little did he know the journey God was going to have me on. But he was speaking life to just a kid 20 years old that was running from the call of God and had no clue what he was speaking into me or the impact that had on me. So not only as leaders do we got to be resilient and headstrong and lead humbly and let people see our vulnerabilities, but man, we got to speak life into those people under us, because while we see ourselves one way, the world sees us as leaders in a very different way. You know, Jesus says, love the Lord your God with all your heart, mind, soul, and strength. And after that, love your neighbor as yourself. That's it. I heard it interesting, and this isn't biblical, so don't take this as biblical, but I heard an interesting account one time of a guy that died and came back from death, went to heaven and came back. And he said, when I stood before Jesus, he asked me something, and he said he just kept asking me the same question. Now, again, whether this is biblical or not, I think it's a great thinking point for all of us. He said, Jesus asked me one question over and over, and the question he asked me is, what did you do for your fellow man? What did you do for your fellow man? Oftentimes in ministry, we can make it about building buildings and reaching people and how many numbers we had and how many baptisms and what was the offering and what did we give away and sometimes I think we need to simplify it and just go, what am I doing for my fellow man? Because I think that's where our legacy really comes from. Not from what we accomplished, but from what did we do for our fellow man?
On part 3 of this 3-part series, Pastor Christian explores leaving a legacy that exemplifies what we have done for our fellow man, and how everything we do determines the shape of that legacy.
My legacy is something I think about a lot. I'm going to be real vulnerable because I think that other leaders need to hear this. When you mess up like I messed up, a lot of people don't know about it, but the people that matter do. I'm terrified for the day my son finds out. I'm terrified the day that my daughters find out. I think of those things all the time. And so as a leader and as a dad and as a husband and as a pastor, you start kind of trying to go, what does my legacy look like? Because now there's this stain on it. And I'll never forget a guy telling me one time after I went through everything, he said, Christian, I was friends with a man one time that walked through something like you're walking through. And he said, he messed up big, left his wife. I think he'd run away with his maid or secretary or something. And I said, no way. He said, yeah, man, and it was bad. And he goes, I wonder whatever happened to that guy. And then he mentioned the name of a very, very famous preacher that all of us would know and do know. And I said, what do you mean? Yeah, he did that? He said, yeah. I said, I didn't know that. And he said, not many people do. He was young. People forgot about it. And he looked at me and he said, Christian, this does not have to define you. This is not what your legacy is going to be. And so as a person walking through it and wrestling with mistakes in my past and going, what is my legacy? I think oftentimes I take that and I try and turn it and go, my legacy can be that I didn't deserve anything I ever got. That it was all about God, that I'm not a great guy, I'm not a great pastor, I'm not a great husband, I'm not a great father. I serve a great God. And because I'm really close to him, I'm able to operate at a great level in a lot of areas of my life. And I think really if I look at my legacy, what do I want people to say about me? I want people to say I was the best friend they ever had. I want people to say Christian was a master of relationships. That guy would not quit on you. That guy was going to stick with you through thick and thin. That guy wasn't going to give up on anyone. and that I wouldn't give up in general. You know, I want people to look at me and go, he's the guy that just won't go away. He just keeps knocking. He just refuses to give up. The enemy can knock him down and try and steal his calling and try and steal his anointing, and the enemy can set him back here, and the enemy can do this, but he's just not going to give up. And I think when I look at it, I just go, hey, I want my children to be able to look at that, because life's hard. As we all know as adults, life is really hard. And I want people to be able to look back and go, man, your dad was relentless. Your dad would not quit. Your dad wouldn't quit calling me. Your dad wouldn't quit chasing after me. Your dad wouldn't quit doing whatever he had to do to help me. And, you know, I think after walking through a couple of the things I've walked through, one with my marriage and two with my brother passing away, I've had the opportunity to walk, I don't know, a dozen couples almost through what me and my wife walked through. And I look at the multiplied impact that my one situation now, that I've got so many people that call me and go, my marriage would not be where it is. We would have divorced if it wasn't for y'all walking us through this. We wouldn't have been able to figure it out if it wasn't for you. And you're able to go, my legacy can be the biggest mistake I ever made can also be the greatest thing I ever did. And I was reminded of David. David in his greatest sin, you know, of being with Bathsheba and killing her husband and walking through in the middle of his greatest sin. It was actually after that the greatest part of his legacy came, which was Solomon. And so his legacy didn't come from slaying Goliath. His legacy didn't come from being a king. His legacy didn't come from any of those things. His actual passed down legacy was carried on through and after his sin. And I just think it's amazing how we can look at that and go, God is able to take our greatest mistake and totally flip it upside down. And it really is true. What the enemy means for harm, God is able to take it and turn it for good. Not only turn it for good, but create a legacy to mock the enemy with it for years to come. And so I think, you know, what is my legacy, man? I want my children to say I'm a great husband. I want my dad used to always say, I want my children to be able to say, I don't know what God is, but he's got to be something like my dad. And I don't know if my children will be able to say that, because I'm not that good of a dad as he was. I'm the greatest dad in the world. But I do want my children to be able to say, my dad was my best friend. He was always there for me. He was the greatest coach and greatest encourager and greatest husband. I saw him love my mom fiercely. I saw him kiss my mom every day and slap her on the butt and go, hey, there ain't no woman out there as fine as you. And I don't ever want my children for 1 second to doubt that. I go to sleep every night and I look at my children and I tell them the same thing after I pray for them. I have 3 children. I have a son who's almost 6. I have a daughter who's 3 and another daughter who's 4 months old. And I take the older one's hands and I look at him and I go, after I pray for him, I say, listen, I love you. You are awesome. You are strong. You are leaders. You are beautiful. You are handsome. You are going to change and they say, world. And then I look at him and I go, listen, I'm a fan of you. And my son always goes, what do you mean, Dad? And I go, I'm a fan of you. I'm your biggest fan. I want your autograph. You're famous to me. And he goes, Dad, stop. What does that mean? And I go, I'm just a fan. I'm crazy about you. And man, I want my kids to grow up knowing I'm crazy about them. Because I think, honestly, that's God's heart. I think if we could really see God's heart for us, it would be him going, if you only knew how crazy I was about you. If you only knew that I'm a fan of you. That I'm Christian's biggest cheerleader. That in spite of the game looking like it could have been over, it was only the first quarter. And that we can look at our children in those same ways, that in the process of growing up, and messing up, and going through all of life that they will go through, that I could look at them and just go, hey, I'm a fan. This is the first quarter. I'm a fan. We're going to win this game. I want my wife to say I was a great husband. You know, at the end of the day, building a great church is awesome. I've always told my dad this. My dad is a very busy man. And we have shared, he would tell you, he sacrificed a lot of our family to build the church that he's built. And he was a very busy man. And there were times that I would look at him and I would say, I hate Pastor Jacob, but I love my dad. all these people you're going to meet with, all these stuff you're running to, the dinners you're missing, the games you're missing, the things you're going to. Dad, are those people going to be there when you're on your deathbed? Are those people going to be there when you're dying and we're holding your hand? And the truth is they won't, but we will. And so I want to invest in the people that are going to be around my bed when I die. I want my wife when I die to go, God, you couldn't have given me a better man on this planet. The ride that we're on is amazing. And you know, I encourage people, this is a brief tip on marriage, because marriage is hard, and maybe you're going through something in your marriage, or maybe you're walking through a season that seems dead or seems dry, and maybe you just go, God, man, I don't know if we're going to make it. And I want to encourage you, think about the long game. The long game is, in 50 years, you're sitting on the back porch of your camp watching your great-grandchildren, your grandchildren play in the yard and fish, and you're sitting there, and your wife's in the rocking chair next to you, and neither of you can really do much anymore, but you rock and drink sweet tea and hopefully hunt. And you look at each other and you just go, hey, we made it. And what is our legacy? It's that kid over there, that 2-year-old kid fishing. And it's that 20-year-old over there in college. And it's the 4 grandchildren we have. And it's the one of us that's a doctor. And it's the preacher that is preaching out of your old Bibles. And what is our legacy? I don't know what, a great church is awesome, but a great church will go away. I'm reminded of the verse where God says, what does he desire from us? Godly offspring. Godly offspring. And I think if I can do that, if I can provide godly offspring, if I can love my wife passionately, then people will say great things about me as a leader. My church will think about me great as a leader. I used to think, man, I got to do something awesome for people to remember me. I got to preach like Billy Graham. I got to build a church like Life Church. I got to do something amazing to be remembered. And what I really realized is I don't have to do anything amazing. I've got to be an amazing husband and an amazing father. And if I can do those things amazing, I will multiply my legacy far more than I could have ever done with anything else. I think the older you get, the more that you realize it's not about what I've built. It's not about what I've accomplished. Or I love Billy Graham. They asked him at the end of his life, if you could have done something different, what would you have done? And there may be those of you listen that you go, well, I mean, I want to build something great. You know, that's great. I'm just telling you, I don't know of somebody that did something greater than Billy Graham in our lifespan, okay, or in the last 100 years. And Billy Graham himself goes, listen, if I could have changed one thing, I would have spent more time with my family. I just thought, how profound, man, that he's accomplished everything as a pastor or as a preacher you could ever want to accomplish. And at the end of all of it, he goes, I wish I would have spent more time hanging out with my kids. I wish I would have played baseball in the backyard with my son more. I wish I would have gone on more dates with my wife. I wish I would have taken my daughter to the movies more. I wish I would have laid on the trampoline in the back while the kids jumped on me. Because at the end of the day, that's what matters. That's what matters. You know, I look at all the legacies around me. There's a lot of great guys that I have the privilege of being around and the privilege of seeing. And my hero's always been my dad since I was a kid. In his victories and in his failures, he's always been my hero. If I could have my son sitting here in 20, 30 years like I am, talking about me the way I talk about my dad, that'd be a win for me. If my son could think about me the way I think about my dad, that would be a win for me. That would be a legacy that would bring me joy. I think the struggles with building a great legacy, though, is there's this constant tension, man. This constant tension between, I know I got to spend time with my children, but I also got to build something to take care of my children. I've also got to do something that shows them how to build this thing called ministry. And I've got to help the world that God called me to help. And it can't be all family and it can't be all work. And it's this constant tension you got to balance between, okay, how much do I build and how much do I spend with my family? And I think it's scary sometimes when you do think of David, and David building everything David built, that he wasn't able to build the one thing he wanted to build. The one thing that David wanted to build was the temple. And it's the one thing that God said, hey, no, you're not going to be the one that builds that. It's going to be your son. And I give a lot of thought to that because I want to build a great church. I want to build the greatest church in the world. I hope when I die, people go, nobody built a church like Christian Aranza. That guy built the greatest church there ever was. Not at the expense of losing my children, though, I'll say that. But I do think, God, what if you just called me to be a great dad and you called my son to build the greatest church the world has ever seen? And I think you got to wrestle with what God's called you to do. And it's a tightrope you walk. It's a tightrope you walk constantly of, am I building my legacy? It's kind of like when the whole yoke concept with oxen. Okay, if one gets too far off, then the other one starts to suffer. I got to make sure that they're even, and sometimes one's a little in front of the other, and you got to pull it back, and the other time, and it's a constant balancing act of going, okay, one, I never want my children to forget they're my priority. My wife's my priority. My marriage is my priority, because I will tell you this, if all you take away from it is this, if she gets off the ride stops. If she gets off the ride stops. And I want to raise children that love me, that grow up and want to be a part of the church, that don't resent the church like I did, but that want to be a part of the church, that their joy is to show up and serve. What would be a great legacy for me is if in 10 years I walk up and my son's just serving on Sunday and I'm going, what are you doing opening doors? And he goes, it's my Sunday to serve. I'm just serving on the dream team. That would be a huge win for me, because that means I would have built church right, and he would have loved church, and I would have built a church that he enjoyed and wanted to be a part of and was proud of me for building. And I think if I could do that, if my daughter one day I don't need them on stage. Some people will go, I want my children to preach. I want them to do whatever God wants them to do. It would be huge for me, though, if they were serving on Sundays. It would be huge for me if my daughter was just working the coffee cart and, hey, what are you doing? Just serving on the dream team. That would be massive. That would probably be a bigger win for me than if they were preaching, because it means that they loved the church so much. They loved the house of God so much that they just wanted to serve like everyone else that we gave our lives to serve. The whole reason I came to Houston, my dad, when I was a little kid, because he came out of Houston and had such a bad experience here and hated it, and he would always tell me, I'm never going back to Houston. But he had this saying that their church lived by, and he even lived by before the church. We're reaching people, building lives, reaching people, building lives. And he would talk about how we're building families and how we're reaching people and robbing hell and populating heaven. But he would always talk about how bad he hated Houston. And I remember thinking as a young kid, if you hate Houston that much, though, who's going to go and help the people in Houston? Who's going to go and help the people in Houston? And so accidentally, the legacy he left in me was the people in Houston really need Jesus. And so I came over here to try and help those 6 million plus people in Houston that really need Jesus. And I've given my legacy in my life, first to my wife, second to my children, and third to the city of Houston. I love this city. After God, my wife, and my children, I want to die serving this city. I want to give everything I have left over after I've given to my family to this city. I believe it's a unique city. I believe it's an awesome city. And so for me, a big win would be if I died in the city of Houston, said, he served us well. Not only did he serve his family well, not only did he serve his generation well, not only did he serve his country well, but he served this city that God called him to really, really well. I think if I could do that, God, man, that would be a win. When Billy Graham died, the world grieved. I don't know if you've ever thought about that, but the entire world grieved when Billy Graham died. And I made a comment to two of my dear friends, Bubba Massey and Caleb Treat out at Church on the Highlands, and said, can you imagine living a legacy where the whole world grieves when you die? Think of that. That would be amazing. If I could impact the world in such a way that just this kid from South Louisiana, this Cajun that when I died, that the world said, God, man, we lost a good one. He made this place a better place. That would be the highlight. That would be the winning reel. If my children loved me, if they served in the church, if my wife spoke well of me, and if when I died, the world was able to go, hey, this guy served us really, really well. I don't know if you can ask for a better legacy than that. I don't need buildings named after me. I don't need my face on billboards. I just want people to go, he served us well. He gave everything he had. He preached his heart out. Maybe one thing he said changed my parents' life, and now I'm a product of that. Or maybe, he did this and it affected my grandchildren. And if I could just do that, if I could take all the leadership qualities and traits of the people I love, the people that have spoken into me and created me who I am, my dad and Tim Delina and Chris Hodges and Dino Rizzo and all of the guys that have poured into me, and the names are countless. If I could take all those traits and be the husbands that they are, the fathers that they are, and then serve the world the way they serve the world, then I would feel comfortable leaving this earth and going, you know what? I gave every single thing I could to this world. And at the end of it, I know that if I can do that, then I'm going to be pleasing to God as well, because that's really what he called us to do. I think when you look at God's priorities and go, God, what makes a great legacy? Jesus says, love the Lord your God with all your heart, mind, soul, and strength. And after that, love your neighbor as yourself. That's it. I heard it interesting, and this isn't biblical, so don't take this as biblical, but I heard an interesting account one time of a guy that died and came back from death, went to heaven and came back. And he said, when I stood before Jesus, he asked me something, and he said he just kept asking me the same question. Now, again, whether this is biblical or not, I think it's a great thinking point for all of us. He said, Jesus asked me one question over and over, and the question he asked me is, what did you do for your fellow man? What did you do for your fellow man? Oftentimes in ministry, we can make it about building buildings and reaching people and how many numbers we had and how many baptisms and what was the offering and what did we give away and sometimes I think we need to simplify it and just go, what am I doing for my fellow man? Because I think that's where our legacy really comes from. Not from what we accomplished, but from what did we do for our fellow man? There's a girl in our church. It's the highlight story for me of this whole church planting journey thus far. And she shows up at an interest meeting we have, and she comes to 21 Days of Prayer every day, and then she's serving on the dream team. And I just assumed she heard about us from another church and came because she saw we were out of Highlands and heard about it and showed up. And Easter Sunday, she goes, I'm walking in to preach, and she's holding the door open, greeting people. And she pulls me aside and she goes, Pastor Christian, listen to me. I need you to preach the best message you've ever preached. And I said, okay, why? She goes, well, my family's coming and they've never been to a church like this before. I said, well, what do you mean? Where did they go to church? She goes, well, we've been Catholic my whole life and we've never been to a church like this. And all of a sudden I realized I'd never asked her story. I just assumed. I was so confused. I said, wait, did you grow up in the Catholic church? And she said, yeah. So how did you find out about us? And she says, I was sitting in a coffee shop and I was studying for a test and I had to use the bathroom, and I looked over and there was a girl wearing a Valley Rise church shirt. And I said, that girl's wearing a church shirt. She looks like someone I can trust. And so I asked her, will you wash my stuff while I run to the bathroom? And she said, yes. And she said, I came back and she invited me to your interest meeting. And I came, and I'd never been to anything like this. And you said, come to 21 Days of Prayer. So I just came to 21 Days of Prayer, and I'd never been to anything like that. And all of a sudden I'm about to preach Easter, and I'm going, oh my gosh, what in the world? And her whole family comes in and sits in the back, and the Easter service goes great. And I give the altar call, and the majority of her family raises their hand. And I remember standing up there thinking, what a legacy What a legacy. This one, when they trace back the lineage of heaven and you look at the girl who invited her from the coffee shop, and this little girl who had never known anything but the Catholic Church shows up at our church, invites her family, her whole family gets saved. Her legacy will look incredibly different. I'm soon to marry her and her almost fiance. And I look at it and I just go, what a legacy. You guys are living the greatest legacy ever because a decision you made changed your whole family. I pray that one day someone tells the story from another perspective and they talk about me leaving an amazing place like Highlands that I should never have even thought about leaving, and come into a city that God just gave me supernatural love for, and trying our best to do church the best we can, and meeting a girl who got saved and invited her family, and they got saved and is going to get married in our church, and their children will grow up differently because of Valley Rise Church. And I look at it and I just go, what are you doing for your fellow man? If we could just do that, if it could just be an invite, if it could just be one person, if it could just be one family, you never know the impact you're making. Some of us, our greatest legacy we will ever leave will happen just by us serving our fellow man. I want to leave you as I close up with wise words from the greatest leader I know. Christmas one year, I unwrapped this gift and opened it up, and it was a Bible. Thanks, Dad. And I opened the cover, and this is what he wrote in it. Christian, my son, this book has never failed me in 54 years. Its words have kept me in my darkest moments. Its promises are being fulfilled in your life as you read this. Read it daily. Obey it quickly. Follow it completely. As you do this consistently, one day they will call you a man of God. Thank you for being a man of God. Nothing could please me more. I love you, Daddy. Press on, my son. The world is waiting for you. Hey, I just want to tell you as you're listening to this, all of us have a legacy to leave. But the greatest legacy you will ever leave may be written on the inside of a Bible to the son that you raise.
As Christians, we're familiar with the term calling. Some callings are universal, such as being called to our salvation through God, being called to follow Jesus, and being called to assist in His efforts to redeem and create the world He envisions. However, how God calls us to accomplish this work and where He calls us to serve is unique to each of us. Developing and deepening our relationship with Jesus and God can not only help us recognize the calling that God has placed inside of us, but also give us the strength, courage, and conviction to see it through. Sometimes we may doubt our calling, and it may even frighten us. We may worry that we are unworthy and undeserving of our calling, or we may have other notions about what we wanted our calling to actually be. Nevertheless, rest assured that God knows all about it, and we can hide nothing from Him. Our feelings, thoughts, fears, they don't matter, nor does it matter if we say no to our calling. God waits patiently until we're ready to accept it. Our calling is ours, and we cannot change it, we cannot trade it, we cannot lose it. Even when we make mistakes and fall short, God still entrusts us with His calling for us. On this episode of Relentless Hope, Pastor Christian Aranza taught us this week that even when we want to let go of our calling, it will never let go of us. We learned how Pastor Christian knew from a young age that God had placed in his heart the calling to preach the gospel and become a man of God. We also learned how much Pastor Christian struggled to accept this calling and how afraid it made him feel. Pastor Christian also taught us that even when we make grave mistakes, God still loves us. He supports us, and He uses our experience to further His calling for an even greater good. As leaders, Pastor Christian encouraged us to lead through our vulnerabilities and our mistakes, letting our people know that when we are not perfect and when we have faced many of the same challenges that they do, that it's okay. He shared with us how he has struggled, messed up, gone astray, and been lost, including having an affair that almost ruined his marriage and burying his 20-year-old brother after a motorcycle accident. Furthermore, Pastor Christian, he wants us to know that his legacy is to be a master of relationships, never giving up on people and never quitting. He talked about the kind of legacy he wants to leave for his kids, for his wife, and for the city of Houston. He encouraged us to make leaving our legacies straightforward. What are we doing for our fellow man? Ultimately, God's calling for each of us is about how we can help usher in his vision for this world and assist Jesus in his mission of redemption. Fortunately, we don't have to answer these questions alone. God showed us, tells us, and places in our hearts how we can best serve him and follow Jesus. All we have to do is open our hearts, be present, listen, and let God guide our hands. If today's podcast resonated with you, I want you to take a moment and share it with someone you love. You never know how one inspirational podcast can change someone's life. My name's Steve Gatena. I'm the host of pray.com's Relentless Hope podcast. And I want you to remember to give hope a voice.